Um, I'm so good. All right. Thanks one more time, everybody. Uh, just happy to be part of the space and have the opportunity to bring a bit of a historical perspective to the conversations we're having. There's a lot to go through, and I can be pretty long-winded in my in-person tours. I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'll try not to give you, get stuck in any one spot. And so I think it's important too, just to kind of ground ourselves in some of these historical stories, just so that we know where we're going. Maybe it's a bit of a trite saying, but I have certainly learned to appreciate history's lessons much more since kind of doing this work. I was in a research space before, and I was all about just like the future and like what's the next technology that's going to fix things. But it's also important to know that we faced similar challenges in the past and what we can learn from them. So to start us off, just a little shout out to our island city's original inhabitants, the Lenape people, which roughly translates to the original people or the true people, and their kind of region of space, which was Lenape Hoeking, which if anybody has the proper pronunciation, please do let me know. And this ranged from New York City all the way down to Philly. It wasn't just like one isolated area. And obviously the ideas of how different cultures use land and occupy land is different. But we're going to be focusing on the island of Manhattan today. Also had a lot of previous names like Manhattan or Manhattaninic. There's a lot of different interpretations for what this word used to mean, including the island of hills, the place where timber is procured for bows and arrows, a cluster of island with channels everywhere, and my personal favorite, the people of the whirlpool. And that was because there used to be a lot of little streams all across the island, and they would make these eddies and coves along the coasts. So the people that were here, I guess, were one with the whirlpools. But our water system story kind of starts with the first European settlers here, which were the Dutch. They set up an outpost for their beaver and fur trades back in the 1600s. This is the bottom of Manhattan. Some notable landmarks include this canal here, which is now Broad Street, and this giant timber wall that was meant to defend against any sort of attack from the north that never happened, and that is now known as Wall Street. But back in the day, the Dutch were here. They protected the mouth of the Hudson River, which is really the kind of highway into the fur trade up north. They have this fort known as Fort Amsterdam. And the life here was, the Dutch were good water people, as in they kind of were all about transforming the land, digging these dikes and channels and canals and transforming, to everything to their best abilities. There wasn't too much fresh water down at this bottom swampy part of the island. Obviously, it's surrounded by the bay, which is connects to the Atlantic Ocean. The Hudson River had some fresh water, but it mixed with the ocean water with the tides, so it was very salty and brackish. It wasn't very usable. But that said, there were some wells established within this little outpost. Not too many, and most of them were for sort of the wealthier classes of people. But a lot of the private wells were actually used for industry, such as the brewers of the day, who were actually very important, prominent people of the time because everybody drank beer. It used to be drank warm back then. Particularly because you couldn't really drink the water. The water was quite literally poo-poo water. It was not very good. The people, as the colony got bigger and bigger, the water was spoiled by the population and also by the free roaming pigs. And that's a whole nother story. But the first sort of water quality issue brought to the local government was between a brewer and a carpenter. Actually, a brewer and a carpenter petitioned the government because a tannery, or a person who makes leathered goods, moved in between them and started polluting their local water source. But the government didn't do anything because everybody else had a chance to sort of make their industry. And this was sort of just the way things were dealt with, as in it wasn't. And that sort of just is a starting point of how our water history sort of starts, as in it wasn't really taken all that seriously. You kind of had to deal with it on your own. And the epitome of it not being taken seriously is the Fort Amsterdam was actually overtaken by the British because they didn't have a well inside of the fort. And so when the British came knocking, they couldn't really defend it for very long before they were going to run out of a critical supply of water. And so they just had to give up and give it over. And that's how we got to, New York. Later on in the 1600s, but this is in the 1700s. The people began to, sorry, my notes just changed page. The fort was changed to Fort James. They changed the colony name to New York. And the first thing that the new government did was dig a well in the fort so they could better protect it. And so New Amsterdam sort of serves as like a microcosm for this bigger story about water conflicts in that will be coming, such as this map already that you can tell that the community is starting to already grow. That wall is down. You can see farmlands to the north, and in particular, I want to bring attention to this little pond up here. It's known as the Collect Pond, and that was one of the original fresh sources of water for the city. This is an illustration of it, and you can see it's looking down towards the south tip of the island, with the Collect Pond in the foreground, and in the background is early New York City. And in the foreground, it's all very much, rustic, kind of still woodland, still wild in a sense, a lot more farmlands, but it wasn't a lot of people. So this water source could remain fresh for a while up until the city encroached upon it, started building businesses and homes around it, and eventually the Collect Pond turned into a giant cesspool, basically. And then it was filled in, and I think there's a park there now. But same old story, local water sources, population grows, kind of encircles it, pollutes it, and then New York has to look a little bit in a different location for their water. Along with the local ponds and streams, the British also put in some water pumps around the public wells. And this did a lot of good for the communities around there because, it was sort of the first sort of public waterworks projects. And not all wells were created equal. Some of them were better than others. The best ones were known as tea water pumps, which is what the little caption says here. And some crafty businessmen would just take water from those public wells and then sell them to people in a private arena. They also served as important social gathering places. A lot of domestic workers would go pick up waters for families. Younger members of the family would go pick up water, and even servants and slaves would go there. And there's a whole other story that you could talk about as far as their importance in sort of creating ideas like we're doing today and being a gathering place for people. At best, the worst pumps of the time smelled really bad, didn't taste very good. But at worst, they also carried a lot of diseases with them, depending on what they were being polluted by, whether it was animal waste, people waste, or kind of the waste of manufactured goods. It's tricky to work two screens at once. Okay. So speaking about diseases, I thought I'd sort of bring us back to the present in a sense, and the reason why we can gather all virtually. And one of the biggest problems back when we didn't have an adequate supply of water was the cholera, which is like a waterborne disease. It causes diarrhea, and you also are throwing up a lot. You're basically losing all your fluids. It's not a good way to go. Back in the 1800s, people didn't even know what cholera came from. But I just wanted to give you guys read a passage for you, which I hope sort of strikes you in its familiarity. So it goes, when doctors cautiously reported the first deaths from the disease, politicians, merchants, and newspaper editors equivocated on alerting the public. Fearing the end of business in America's commercial capital, Recorder Richard Riker, the city's chief magistrate, conspired to delay an official announcement of the cholera's threat until early July, when it was too late for quarantines or other emergency measures. 19 people died on July 7th, but by the end of the month, 2,000 were dead. The toll would have been higher, but over 100,000 New Yorkers decided to flee. An unwanted silence pervaded the city by midsummer. One could walk the length of Broadway and scarce meet a soul. The dense cloud of smoke from factory furnaces and domestic hearths that often hung over the city was scarcely discernible in August. So I'm gonna let you sit with that for just a second. And the reason why I share it is less so much to kind of like partially it's shock and awe. I hope it sort of provoked some sort of universal reaction, but also I think a cynical take could be that like, oh boy, here we are again, sort of dealing with similar problems of society. But at the same time, I have a couple more not so happy stories to go into, but ultimately today we can have this conversation, or at least I'm having this conversation from New York City, because we've sort of fixed the problem and have one of the best water sources in the country, if not the whole world. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and we've risen to multiple challenges in the past, which is what I hope you can take away from this as well. Um, Back then, getting back to back in the 1800s, water wasn't a public utility. It was it was provided by a lot of different public companies. They all serviced people with different means, such as digging wells or constructing very early infrastructure like these brick pipes and sometimes aqueducts made out of wood. One such company is known as the Manhattan Water Company, but they weren't very good. A lot of these private companies sort of cut corners to make a buck, and particularly the Manhattan Water Company wasn't all that interested in actually providing water to its citizens. It was more interested in keeping track of the customers' bank accounts and ledger systems and all this stuff. So they did such a bad job that the city eventually had to take away their water responsibilities so that they could improve upon it. But they let the company keep its ledger system and its account tracking. And over the years, that company morphed into a lot of different types of companies, but ultimately became what we know today as Chase Manhattan Bank. So that also, water reaches everything. And today we have a much more sort of public facing effort behind our water systems. Whoops. Another disaster that struck the city was a huge fire in 1835. Because another thing we use water for that hopefully we don't have to think about too much, but we can't forget, is our emergency services. And this fire blew up back in the wintertime of 1835. So the little infrastructure that did exist didn't work because the water froze inside of the pipes. So firefighters had to just deal with the bucket and pails and the water pumps. And this fire only went out because some sailors from the Brooklyn Navy Yard blew up a bunch of buildings. So when the fire reached them, it couldn't go any further. When everything was said and done, 700 buildings were down, mostly warehouses and businesses, not too much high of a death toll, which is good. But it bankrupted all the insurance companies in the cities and caused a huge economic loss for the city. But sometimes that economic damage kind of fosters more of an impetus for change than, unfortunately, sometimes human tolls. And so people actually started to make moves to fix this problem of inadequate supply and insecure water system. So what they did is they looked to the north. North of the city is Westchester and Putnam counties. Today it's suburbia, but back then it was very much still wilderness, farmland, small communities. And what they did was they looked for a different source of water. The Bronx River was deemed too small. The Hudson River was deemed too polluted. But eventually they found and settled upon the Croton River. So this is an illustration, again, looking south. Manhattan is in the far background with some ships in the bay beyond the Long Island and Brooklyn. And up in the foreground, you see that there's a dam here. So there's a dam blocked the river so that there was a backup of water and you create a reservoir. This reservoir then is hooked up to an aqueduct. This is this line that comes all the way down here. And this aqueduct was over 35 miles long because this river was over 40 miles away from the city. And it was actually one of the largest engineering projects of its time. And when it was completed, it was the cause of much fanfare and celebration because New York City finally went from a city with some of the worst water in the country to some of the best water in the country. And that's all because they had to expand and kind of look a little bit farther up north. But the story doesn't end there because as the city started to grow in the 1900s, all the 5 boroughs came together, which effectively doubled the population and how many people were depending on this new water system. So eventually the city started to look even farther north up into the Catskill Mountains and the Delaware Watershed, which is anywhere from 75 to over 100 miles away from New York City. And this started to happen in the early 1900s after a lot of water scares, a lot of droughts, and also a lot of political fighting about where they were actually going to find their water, because if it wasn't the Catskills, it could have been the Appalachians. Some people were saying the Hudson was clean and cheap. And there's always a lot of these different fights. But eventually it was settled upon to go north and cross the Hudson River up into the Catskill Mountains regions. This is both a present and past photo of one of the reservoirs. And one of the reasons why they also had to do that is because there wasn't any sort of water conservation plans. There was no effort to sort of limit how much water people were getting. Not so much for a bad reason, because some people who were in charge of the water development believe that water should have been as free as air. And how great would it be if we could be the city that provides these basic necessities to everybody, no matter how rich or how poor they were. So they weren't really enthusiastic about metering and tracking how much water was being used. But that meant that they were always sort of looking for more and more space to take over and convert into these reservoirs so that New York would have an adequate supply of water. And so where they looked was up in the Catskill Mountains, where there are already people living there. But these projects were really big. In this small little map that you can see in the corner here, that's the Ashokan Reservoir. And that actually had to be flooded. It was a valley, a river valley, where people and businesses and communities have already set up. The whole region in general was mostly forested, but these small communities did exist. And they were ultimately, their lands were condemned and bought from the city by eminent domain, sold back to the people for reasonable rates, or at least what the city sort of decided was reasonable. There's political infights and a whole lot of struggles and legal lawsuits and things to sort of try to preserve a way of living up in the mountains. But ultimately New York won and took these lands from the communities that were already there and then started building these giant tunnels, which you can see here. And yeah, I could just pretend that I'm frozen if I just don't move, but I'm back. So the water, the 5 boroughs, reasons for, oh yeah, and so the reasons why they wanted to come all the way over here was a couple of reasons. So first is that these mountains were up high compared to the city, which is down at sea level. So that would allow them to sort of bring the water down with as minimal energy cost. All the water that comes to the city now is completely gravity fed. Once it's down here, you have to pump it up into buildings, but there's a very low energy cost. There's a big upfront infrastructure cost, but to maintain it afterwards is pennies based on having to upgrade engines and create the infrastructure that is going to be using, coal or fossil fuels today that would have been needed if they didn't actually opt for a gravity fed system. Oops. And this is just a shot of what the town of Shokin used to be. And right now that's all underwater in what is the west side of the Ashokan Reservoir. Again, the sort of idea about conservation wasn't really a thing. The needs of the city and its millions of people, or hundreds of thousands, closing in on millions of people, were deemed more important and more utilitarian than sort of this rural way of living. So they kept sort of looking, the Board of Water Supply, which was in charge of building this large infrastructure, was always on the lookout for, improved paths or other regions with good water flow. And in this shot right here, this is the Hudson River. The surveyors had to also make plans to cross it. And rather than going above it, which has its own costs and risks, our aqueducts actually dive almost 900 feet below the Hudson River and come back up on the other side and continue its journey down here. And all this was being constructed back in the early 1900s into the 1950s. The expansion to the Delaware Watershed, which is situated inside of the Catskill Mountains, but is a little bit different from the first expansion, brought new questions. It wasn't just about local communities. The Delaware Watershed is where the Delaware River starts. The Delaware River runs through New York, through New Jersey, down to Pennsylvania, all the way down into Chesapeake Bay. So now there are interstate concerns and political negotiations that have to go on with other states. Sometimes very much out in the open, trying to be collaborative, other times sort of, behind closed doors and shaking deals with one state so that the other state now has to make a deal. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself as well. And I'm being a little bit more light on these details only because you guys are going to get a chance to sort of explore this sort of modern system that we currently have. And so I kind of just want to leave you with a couple of big picture stats, which is that now we have about, I think it's 12 reservoirs or 6 main reservoirs and like 12 controlled lakes, all 100 equaling to about 550 billion gallons of water. 90% of which comes from the Catskill Mountains, 10% of which comes from the Croton. Uh, 550 billion gallons sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but New York City uses 1 billion gallons. That's one with 9 zeros, billion gallons every single day, every single 24 hours. So that 550 is a good kind of buffer if we're ever in danger of decreased rain or changes in weather patterns, but it's not perfect. You know, it's a year and a half, year and some change. So it's today something we keep in check with actual new measurements and conservation. But just the feat and the scale is, you know, something to be impressed of. It's also the largest unfiltered water system in our country, one of the biggest in the world. The Delaware Aqueduct, which connects to the Delaware Watershed, is the longest tunnel in the world, and all it does is bring water to New York City. You can drive 2 school buses stacked on top of each other through these tunnels. And today, kind of the biggest concerns and challenges around our water system is about keeping the water quality as good as it is. Year after year, New York State kind of wins in terms of rankings in drinking water. It's sort of known as the champagne of drinking water. And I'm not just saying that because I love New York, but you know, other states have said it. So I'll let them, you know, keep saying it. And one of the reasons why is because all this land that you see here, it's buffeted. All these reservoirs are buffered by natural forests, and these natural forests and rock formations, when it rains, helps filter the water out. And by the time it gets to these reservoirs, it's already pretty clear. The water sits in these reservoirs for months on end, where the sun and the elements do more to filter or clean it up, and then eventually it's led down by use of gravity to New York City. And so the final note I'll leave everybody on is that that we're highly adaptable. This system was built over a long period of time. It was built piecemeal. It wasn't like, you know, people had a vision as far as where they're going to go and, you know, always sort of thinking about what the next step was. But this is a system that has been built over 150 years. They're still working on certain parts of it. It's taken many administrations, a lot of different leaders, a lot of different organizational groups, a lot of different parties to make this happen. And there's been injustices in terms of its creation, in terms of taking away people's communities, in terms of what kind of infrastructure is maintained down here in the city. But in the end, it's really, truly a triumph of our civilization because, you know, we don't have to worry about cholera. A lot of people don't think about where their water comes from. You flush the toilet and it's there. And so, you know, I hope we can just, as much as focus on all the issues and the problems that still need to be solved, can appreciate and really not take for granted this fresh source of water that if you're in the city, you know, you're using to shower, to drink, to clean your clothes, and to flush the toilet. So I'm over time. I'll end it there and take any and all questions.